Hello, my name is Martin Hargreaves. The theme of this year's Fest and Fest Lab is conviviality, living alongside, coming together, or experiencing this togetherness as at a feast or celebration. Unfortunately, I can't be there to take part in the dinner discussions, and so Hannah and Heidi have asked me to prepare and record a lecture that responds to this theme in some way. What follows isn't quite a lecture, more a series of notes, which articulate my thinking about how to push this celebratory togetherness, this conviviality, towards ecstasy. Prologue, betrayed by words. I'm interested in how conviviality can extend into the pleasures and the pains of being alongside that in some way rupture individualism, or at least challenge the boundaries of the self. The ideas I'm going to gesture towards in these notes emerge out of my current reading, writing, and dramaturgical practices. I've just written a chapter for a forthcoming book on choreography and writing, and in it I stage meetings with and between Susan Sontag and Jean Genet. Genet in particular was interested in all kinds of ecstasies that arise from transgression. And in this quote that I put on the slide, he links this to betrayal. This is from Prisoner of Love, Genet's last book, which was published in 1986 after he died. And in this, he proposes that translation is betrayal, which is motivated by ecstasy. And I'll read the quote. Once we see in the need to translate the obvious need to betray, we shall see the temptation to betray as something desirable, comparable perhaps to erotic exaltation. Anyone who hasn't experienced the ecstasy of betrayal knows nothing about ecstasy at all. For Genet, all forms of writing are acts of translation. Words move, and in this movement they lose meaning and invent new ways to sit alongside other words, betraying the intention of the author in order to find poetics outside of their voice. Rather than lament how he is not captured by his own autobiographic writings, Genet celebrates the infelicities of language and how, when writing about himself, he becomes ecstatic. He is dispossessed by the words he uses to refer to himself. Genet's desire is often to invert accepted ethics and provoke revulsion and revolution in these acts of betrayal. Ecstasy for him is not self-pleasure, even though he repeatedly links it to masturbation. It is instead the pleasure of undoing the self, allowing the self to be annihilated by all the betrayals and misfires of language that are implicit in any act of coming together. So I start with Genet as a way to remind myself that as I write out these notes and then read them to you now, I will not approach ecstasy. He reminds me that when I attempt to be faithful to the words I'm speaking to you now, then I miss the chance for erotic exaltation that only comes from betrayal. This betrayal will only arrive in the listening, in the mishearing of my words, and their reassembling outside of my authorship. Obviously, I don't enjoy listening to my own voice. It becomes strange and it betrays me. And although Genet encourages us to wallow in abject ecstasies, I probably won't listen to this before I send it to Hannah and Heidi. Note 1. Maybe ecstasy is with us all along. In several of North American philosopher Judith Butler's writings, she uses the word ecstatic as a way to think about moments of being undone by the touch of a lover, or by the grief at the removal of that touch, but also how these pleasurable or painful ecstasies are part of a general condition of being outside oneself. Ecstasy, for Butler, is not only a name for how we experience ourselves in exceptional states of bliss or loss, it is also a means of naming the vulnerable precarity of bodies and how they are constituted within networks of support that sustain and restrict life. In the quotes I've put on the screen now, you can see that Butler moves between a personal political sense of the ecstatic as one which makes a public claim for desire and mourning, and an ecological sense of ecstasy, in which bodies live within flows and stoppages of support systems and networks of exchange. The first quote is from Precarious Life from 2004, and I'll read it now. Maybe ecstasy is more persistent than that. Maybe it is with us all along. To be ecstatic means, literally, to be outside oneself, and thus can have several meanings. To be transported beyond oneself by a passion, but also to be beside oneself with rage or grief. I think that if I can still address a we, or include myself within its terms, I'm speaking to those of us who are living in certain ways beside ourselves, whether in sexual passion or emotional grief or political rage. And the second quote that I put on the screen is from Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly from 2015. And I'll read that one. We could say that the body exists then in an ecstatic relation to the supporting conditions it has or must demand. But this means that the body never exists in an ontological mode that is distinct from its historical situation. Perhaps it helps to put it this way. The body is exposed to history, to precarity, and to force, but also to what is unbidden and felicitous, like passion and love, or sudden friendship, or sudden or unexpected loss. This sense of embodied subjectivity has given over from the start into the hands of others, human and more than human, who may at any moment remove this touch, or move the force of this touch towards violence or abandonment, is one way to think through the politics of convivial ecstasy. Butler's ideas of ecstasy are that we are bound in it. It is a foundation and it confounds us. The possibility to speak as myself and to join a table to feast alongside is at the same time the possibility I might be undone by the words of others, and I might not receive the sustenance I need to live. Butler's claim is not that all ecstasies are the same, or that all bodies can survive and thrive beside themselves in the same way. She distinguishes between precariousness and precarity. Precariousness is the ecstasy that is foundational, and precarity is the socio-economic political distribution of this through vulnerability. Her attention to historical situatedness means that we cannot propose only one mode of ecstatic embodiment, or only one mode of giving ourselves over to the pleasure of others' touches. Any mode is entangled in wider nets of ecstatic precariousness. We do not choose to live alongside others, because the very possibility of choice is handed to us by those bodies, handed down to them through histories of which bodies and lives have come to be livable. Our bodies are always already beside themselves, in this bind of being alongside others, and they're sustained not only through material conditions for life, but through effective and discursive choreographies that distribute value on bodies in space and across time. Whatever agency we do claim over our singular bodies is both enabled and limited by how we are sustained by others. Note 2. We spend a lifetime running after our life, running into that soft wall, looking for the energy to die. This note borrows its title from a stanza in a poem called Fog, written by Ethel Adnan and published in 2012. And on the screen there's an extract from an essay that she wrote for Documenta in 2011, and a drawing from 2015, which both share the name, The Cost for Love We're Not Willing to Pay. Adnan was born in Beirut in 1925. She lived and worked in California and died in Paris in 2021. She was a prolific visual artist, poet, and essayist. And I've turned to her partly because two books from her sit on my desk next to the computer where I'm writing this, but also because I remembered that in an interview, her work was characterized as approaching the unbearable and the ecstatic. Much of her celebrated writing attempts to come to terms with the various wars she experienced throughout her long lifetime, with her asking how to register in a mundane everyday embodiment, the traumas of global conflict, and the wounds of anti-Arab violence. But she also asks how to survive the attack on the boundaries of the self that come from desire, from love, and from friendship. In this text and artwork, she considers love as shattering and yet also commonplace. And I'll read the part that I've highlighted. How can one bear such an intensity? Love becomes a river of fire that replaces blood in the arteries. It leaves one breathless. One wants to stay still, not moving, having forgotten the hour. Even the sense of one's body disappears. The body disappears from memory. There's an immobility due to the total mobilization of the senses, functioning henceforth in an altered state. Desire itself is eventually overcome. Strangely enough, this state approximates the experience of death. This altered state of love, where the body disappears in a mobilized immobility, is similar to the Butlerian notions of the ecstatic. Adnan's artistic practice stays around the unanswerable question of how to face the intensity of being beside oneself, with others, recognizing that we simultaneously crave these experiences, but also cannot bear them. We cannot pay the cost of love because we do not survive it intact. Like Butler, Adnan moves across the scale of ecstasies, from those between two bodies and those between two nations at war. Sometimes the unbearable pleasure of living is from simply carrying on when death is looming over those we love. Sometimes it is this love which exceeds our capacity to account for it. Sometimes we are overwhelmed by the proximity to suffering that prickles the skin, even from across continents. And sometimes we are pricked by an experience of art as a mystic contemplation of death and life. And sometimes the ethics of writing letters are a way to deal with how language both dispossesses and situates us. Adnan's writing for me is an invitation into the pole of love and the possibility of surviving at its edges. Before I move on, I want to read an extract from her poem entitled To Be in a Time of War, published in 2005, but written in response to the announcement of the US and UK attack on Iraq beginning in 2003. It's written entirely in the infinitive, and it reads almost like a set of performative instructions on how to live while death is being dealt. An unrealizable score for how to be small while registering a globalized shock and awe campaign. If you're interested, there is a website, eteladnan.com, where you can find the whole poem, but I've chosen 2 stanzas to read. To push aside fear, to draw back the curtains, to decide that it's the same, to choose between absolute sorrow, sorrow with no respite, and death, to breathe soot and uncertainty, to put off all lights and project mental images on the wall, to start a battle to the end, to shift the battle to the next generation, to be aware of the inherent futility of any action, to get out of the house, out of the self, to start in the morning the long wait for the night, to make truth explode, to make countries explode, to feel impatient in front of nothingness, to wash one's hands and brush one's teeth, to notice that mirrors shine during the night and that the mail is waiting to be answered, to worry about the war being waged so far away, so secretly, to already think of the next war, to hammer one's anguish on oneself, to bring about a bird's world in one's imagination, to gaze at the Hudson River through one's eyelashes, to spit pollution, to drive through a green light, to avoid an accident, to become an object, to become the object that that object protects, to hang on nothing, to live with no desires. Note 3. To accept exploding from time to time. I've recently been working with Portuguese dance artist Maria Ferreira Silva, whose current research practice has the title Wild Explosion of Radical Softness. As part of our work together, Maria proposed that we read alongside each other various texts by Catherine Malabou, a French philosopher who has worked on and with the concept of plasticity. Malibu has applied this concept to many different discursive fields, and in her book, What Should We Do with Our Brains?, she explores this concept with reference to neuroscientific accounts of the brain, and I've highlighted 2 sections. I'll read the first section now. She writes, "The word plasticity thus unfolds its meaning between sculptural moulding and deflagration, which is to say explosion. From this perspective, to talk about the plasticity of the brain means to see in it not only the creator and receiver of form, but also as an agency of disobedience to every constituted form, a refusal to submit to a model." Malibu's plastic explosions aren't quite ecstasy, but they're not ecstasy either. And I read some alignment with the other ways I've been thinking so far in these notes. For Malibu, explosiveness is necessary within the taking on of form, including the taking on of forms of identity. The brain continues to grow through explosive moments that risk annihilation, but simultaneously create new possibilities for thought and action. In the conclusion to this book, Malibu suggests that neural flexibility is demanded by capitalism as we continue to bend to its will and internalize self-control. And this is the taking on of form part of plasticity. But Malibu calls for the other function, for plastic explosions, incendiary movements of resistance and ethical rage that can help us to think and act and be alongside each other differently, to short-circuit the synaptic speeds through which we have internalized paranoid individualism. And I'll read the quote I've highlighted. "To cancel the fluxes, to lower our self-controlling guard, to accept exploding from time to time. This is what we should do with our brain. It is time to remember that some explosions are not in fact terrorist explosions of rage, for example. Perhaps we ought to relearn how to enrage ourselves, to explode against a certain culture of docility, of amenity, of the effacement of all conflict, even as we live in a state of permanent war." I can't do justice to the complexities and the pleasures of my conversations with Maria in these notes. But before I move on, I wanted to speak about our most recent meeting, where we began to tackle a conversational essay between Malibu and Butler on their reading of Hegel's on lordship and bondage. Neither Maria nor I can claim to be Hegel experts, so we're moving very slowly through the text, exploring ideas that emerge for us, or following references that Butler or Malibu make, and allowing ourselves to go after them on tangents. This opening paragraph, with the green highlight that I've put on the screen, foregrounds how both Butler and Malibu, and Maria and I, share an interest in the body as a vexed question, one bound to itself through others, and one dispossessed by the attachments that constitute it. In the text that follows, they offer different readings of Hegel, and they disagree in where, what, and how his text lays out a relationship to bodily substitution and submission, to transcendence and transference. Where their analysis meets, though, is in thinking that the vexed question of the body isn't necessarily one that has answers. And this is because they both understand the body as besides itself, not self-contained, but experienced only through relationships with others, through dispossession and convivial ecstasies. Maria's project that I've been speaking about focuses on a practice of moving with fabrics which clothe, drape, disguise, augment, and extend the form of her body. As she flows through relationships to the silk-like swathes of fabric, the dancing calls in relationships to classical statuary and also to the 20th century modern dancers who also made use of fabric to refashion what a woman could be and how she might appear. Isadora Duncan, Loie Fuller, Mary Wigman, and many others haunt the work. Another aspect of Maria's interest in plasticity is precisely in thinking through how we perceive form by pulling it into relations with already known form, already known icons and images. Meaning that any image is already outside of itself, in textual relationships to broader visual cultures. Neither Maria or I obviously saw those early feminist dance artists perform, And yet, through various pedagogic situations and reiterations of the canon, they have become part of a visual schema through which we see a female-identified body duetting with flowing fabric. And of course, this is historically and culturally specific to the schools and theatres that we've been passing through. What this research into plasticity is helping us to address in our ongoing conversations is, in practice, how to acknowledge the ways in which form iterates form, how dance becomes visible, but also how it offers the chance for explosive moments of reorganizing how we think about bodies, how we traverse the spaces between dancer and audience, and how we continually reframe the demand for you to be my body for me. Note 4, dissociation and rave space. The reason I'm not attending Fest and Fest Lab this year is because I'll be at Sonar Festival in Barcelona, and in part the ecstasies that hopefully await me there have informed what I'm now recording in these notes. I'll be meeting up with my boyfriend, Aurelio, and although he doesn't come from what we sometimes refer to as the dance world, his world has been shaped by a dance practice, particularly that of queer techno parties in New York, Berlin, and elsewhere. He's been regularly dancing in those contexts for over 20 years, and has a very sophisticated practice of being outside himself in those spaces, dancing inside the music. I don't have a similarly developed practice, and I've only really approached and touched on the ecstasies afforded by those scenes when I've been dancing alongside him. So this final note is something of a tourist postcard. I'm not claiming rave culture as my own, and these notes don't emerge from within. They are informed by the various dispossessions of my love for him, on the dance floor and elsewhere, but also by the recent writings of Mackenzie Walk in her book Raving. Walk is a professor in culture and media, originally from Australia, who writes about her return to rave culture after transitioning, in order to explore her relationship to her body inside of techno music. Walk runs a series at a club in Bushwick, in Brooklyn, called Writing on Raving, as a means to foreground and exchange with a plurality of voices who want to document and articulate in language the personal and political ecstasies of dance music scenes. She also co-edited an issue of E-Flux with Madison Moore, and I put the cover on the screen here. And this edition takes the title Black Rave, as a way to acknowledge how dance music has emerged from articulations of blackness, in and through tensions with public spaces, illegal gatherings, pharmaceutically enhanced modes of transcendence, and queer and trans world-making. Walk's own book takes up an auto-ethno-fiction approach, situating her voice and experience as emerging in dialogue with many others, some of whom are also theorists of raving, and some who are her trans sisters who dance with her. There's many ideas in this book, but there's two that I want to linger on here, and those are xeno-euphoria and ketamine feminism. Xeno-euphoria is the ecstasy of becoming alien to oneself, riding the strangeness of the beats of techno music into somatics that are not honed into natural wholeness or a oneness, but towards technological dissociation and a relational subjectivity. Walk suggests that the reason techno is a home to queer and trans communities is because this xeno-euphoria takes place and splits space and time outside of dominant visual regimes of what a body should look like or should feel like. The body becomes simultaneously alert and open, refiguring its synaptic rhythms, moving beyond what it knows. French dance artist Frédéric Guise has also developed a rave practice which he calls technosomatics. And in his workshops and collective dancing alongside, he proposes that raves can offer deep engagement with reorganizing the body through dancing, in relation to the endocrinal system and with chakras. A similarity between how Walk writes about raving and Guise's practice is in the proposal that ecstatic states brought on through techno can focus in on the body as a site of investigation. And I want to now read the extract from Walk's book that I put up on the screen. The state of xeno-euphoria, time becomes stringently horizontal, neither rising nor falling, just sideways swelling and slimming. The body slots in, to time, finding itself stranded through itself, through losing the form of its being in time. I have to be patient, open, present for it. Let thinking flake off and fall away from the I. Then comes the pretty strangeness into this body, out of the drugs it took, the beat it endures. This is the need, that for a few beats or thousands, I'm not here, not anywhere, in the place where there's usually me, with all her anxieties and racing thoughts and second guesses. There's just happy flesh, pumping and swaying, tethered only by gravity. A trans body homing in on its own estrangement, losing itself in these alien beats among this xeno flesh. Trans, the crossing towards the stranger's gift, xeno. This body that doesn't dance very well but loves to anyway, be gone anyway in this way. Also, I imagine. I'm not there to notice. It's what I feel or rather felt happen after it's gone. Then that becomes something else. Without me knowing it, thought splinters, shards out sideways, north, south, east and west. Free jazz solos flocking around each other. Body and mind both home, both happy, both into each other. Both free to see other people, to be polyamorous with time. Welcome to rave space. Rave space for the walk is important, not only as a framework for a singular experience of xeno-euphoria, but raving is collective. Raving is learning to live alongside one another. Raving is convivial. Walk offers the notion of ketamine feminism as a coming together of femme flesh and exaltation within erotics that cannot be instrumentalized. The specific effects of ketamine enhance an already dissociative experience in techno, where bodies work collectively with intense forms of differentiated labor, working hours productively to produce a togetherness that cannot be owned and that cannot be extracted or traded. Walk also warns us, however, that techno spaces are not utopic and they're not fully resistant to capital, but they do offer moments of ecstatic and explosive conviviality that have queer effects that last long after the drugs wear off. And I'll read that second quote. To make flesh here, inside this city, in the surround, in a time that reels off sideways, let's call it K time, like the time of the K-hole, folded into duration. This other time, K time, happens only in the rave continuum. This K time is not a time of duration. This K time is not a messianic time, it is an immanent time. This K time is not a time of duration, the romantic other of machine time. Rather, it's machine time amplified to the moment where it splits from duration and takes the body into a sideways time, without memory or expectations, without history or desire. A dissociative time, a transsexual time, a ketamine time, a time that's driven, a time of drives, a time without desire yet which still fucks, the time where together we might feel the presence of ketamine feminism. Epilogue, the pleasure to come. Although I don't know exactly when you'll be listening to this, I'm at this moment getting ready to travel. Not everything is packed and the plants aren't all watered, so after I stop recording, I'll go and do that. I'm aware there's a whole strand of thinking around ecstasy that I haven't had time to touch. That is of the Lacanian concept of jouissance, and particularly how it's refigured in the writing of Julia Kristeva and Roland Barthes. I've been edging around those ecstasies, but I don't really have time to give in to them just yet. They are delayed pleasures to come. I'm going to put Roland Barthes' The Pleasure of the Text in my bag, and whether I'll spend any time with it is yet to be seen. There's a part in his book where he temporarily opposes pleasure and bliss, although he doesn't finally keep to this opposition. He says that whenever we try and write about ecstasy or about bliss, we maybe only arrive at a weakened version, at pleasure. Following a certain strand of psychoanalysis, he suggests that bliss cannot be directly spoken of in language. It is a rupture. It annihilates the written word. He suggests that you cannot write on bliss, but you can maybe write from it, in it, but not speak of it. So maybe on my holiday, when I read this, I'll find out that these notes have been portrayed from the beginning, and it hasn't been ecstasy all along that I've been thinking about, but this weakened version of pleasure. Either way, I'm recording this as an attempt to answer Heidi and Hannah's request, and as an attempt to be there alongside you, outside of my body, which is elsewhere. Perhaps that is all that these notes can lay claim to, that they arrived associated and undone, and in that there are some pleasures. Thank you.